Welcome back, everyone. Mr. P here again with part 2 of our dive into my response to the two-sentence horror story on Reddit from a couple weeks ago. If you enjoy this sort of thing, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, yada yada yada. You know the drill. I doubt you're new to YouTube and forgot how all this works.
I have no memory of this place.
So, without further ado, let's get to it. So, if you haven't watched part 1 yet, I'll link to that in the description, and I highly recommend listening to that one first before going any further, since this is going to build on the discussion there. Essentially, this is like missing a class, but your professor has the lecture uploaded online so you don't fall behind. Don't say I never did anything for you. Unlike your lazy professor that doesn't upload lectures that you may have missed. You're welcome.
So what I believe you were trying to say is thank you.
Thank you?
You're welcome.
No test over this either, so again, you're welcome.
What can I say except you're welcome?
To recap from last time, I spoke briefly about the nature of God, and, as I said then, this was not intended to be an in-depth study, but to merely scratch the surface of the topic. Also, I am coming at this from a Trinitarian perspective, which I also briefly explained, and I also said that for now, we're taking this as a given, since I don't want to get into that too much yet, since I'm more interested in laying a basic foundation for Christian theology as it relates to who God is. I spoke briefly of God's attributes, providing several different names of God and their meanings. Some of these were His holiness, righteousness, and justice, which are brought against sin. And you'll recall that I also gave a brief explanation of why sin has eternal consequences. Today, I want to expand on this last idea with a brief synopsis of the biblical doctrine of sin and man. Now, if you listened to the last video, there were several big words that I threw out that described major doctrines. There is, of course, the word theology itself, which has to do with the knowledge of or the study of God. The Greek word theos is the root of that word. Today, we'll be examining the doctrine of sin and man. The doctrine of sin is Hamartiology, from the Greek word for sin, hamartia, and deals with, well, what sin is. This deals with its fundamental nature and what it extends to. This will, by necessity, cross over into how it affects man. That's because, if I didn't mention it before, there really is no single doctrine that stands in isolation from other doctrines. Your view of God impacts your view of man, sin, salvation, etc. All of them interact with one another in some way. So, what is sin?
Sin.
No, not that overgrown manatee. I mean, what is it from a biblical perspective? Well, let's take a look at a very direct passage to see how the Bible defines it. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. 1 John 3:4. So, simply put, sin is that which goes against the law of God. It is to act as though the law of God does not apply or does not exist. It's also not uncommon to see the word transgression used, such as in Isaiah 53:6, which carries the idea of rebellion. Regardless, sin is that which violates God's commands, His standard of what is right and wrong. This standard is based on His nature. We are to strive to be holy as He is holy, Leviticus 27 and 26. Anything short of that is sin. Sin entered into creation first through the rebellion of Satan, which is referenced in Isaiah 14:12-15. How you have fallen from heaven, you star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who defeated the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Isaiah 14:12-14. Though the passage overall is addressed to the king of Babylon, there are certain parts of this description that can also be seen as reference to Satan, such as Jesus' words in Luke. And he said to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Luke 10:18. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but we also have the Genesis account where the serpent, presumably under the control of Satan, influences man to rebel against God. The eating of the fruit, whatever it was the first act of rebellion against God, and it was through Adam's sin that all of humanity was condemned, as Paul explains in Romans 5. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not counted against anyone when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned in the likeness of the violation committed by Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. Romans 5:12-14. I'll go into this a little more later when we get into the doctrine of man, but for now, understand that Adam's sin brought the curse of sin onto all of humanity. This is where the idea of original sin comes from. In Adam, all of man was tested. Under ideal circumstances, with no sin nature, Adam still chose to rebel. It's never explained why he did so, but it happened nonetheless. All of us were brought under sin as a result. There was a spiritual change that took place which corrupted not only Adam, but all of creation was affected as well, including the introduction of death. Now, we are condemned not because we are guilty of Adam's sin in particular. We aren't punished for something we didn't do. However, sin corrupts everything and renders us incapable of doing anything pleasing toward God. As Romans 8 says, "For those who are in accord with the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who are in accord with the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. Because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so, and those who are in the flesh cannot please God." Romans 8:5-8. Paul's argument, which actually began earlier in chapter 7, is that the lost, those who do not believe and have not put their faith in Christ, are still in the flesh and are incapable of doing anything pleasing to God. This is because their minds are influenced by sin and they do not obey with the right motives, though they often convince themselves otherwise. To give you an example of how this works, let's take a quick look at Isaiah 10. Here, Isaiah delivers a message from God which foretells the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by Assyria. "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I send it against a godless nation, and commission it against the people of my fury, to capture spoils, and to seize plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. Yet it does not so intend, nor does it plan so in its heart, but rather it is its purpose to destroy and to eliminate many nations. For it says, Are not my officers all kings? Is not Calno like Carchemish, or Hamath like Arpad, or Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols, whose carved images were greater than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do the same to Jerusalem and her images, just as I have done to Samaria and her idols? So it will be that when the Lord has completed all his work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the arrogant pride of his eyes. For he has said, By the power of my hand and by my wisdom I did this, because I have understanding. And I removed the boundaries of the peoples and plundered their treasures, and like a powerful man I brought down their inhabitants. And my hand reached the riches of the peoples like a nest. As one gathers abandoned eggs, I gathered all the earth. And there was not one that flapped its wing, opened its beak, or chirped. Is the axe to boast itself over the one who chops with it? Is the saw to exalt itself over the one who wields it? That would be like a club wielding those who lift it, or like a rod lifting the one who is not wood. Therefore, the Lord, the God of armies, will send a wasting disease among his stout warriors, and under his glory a fire will be kindled like a burning flame, and the light of Israel will become a fire, and Israel's Holy One a flame, and it will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in a single day. and he will destroy the glory of his forest and of his fruitful garden, both soul and body. And it will be as when a sick person wastes away, and the rest of the trees of his forest will be so small in number that a child could write them down. Isaiah 10, 5-19. The Assyrians carried out God's judgment against a rebellious people. However, they had nothing but corrupt and evil intentions in doing so. This meant that even though they did something that was good in the sense of bringing destruction to a rebellious people as God intended, their wills were evil. Now, this is an extreme illustration, but the principle should be clear. Those who are lost may show some imitation of God's law, but if their hearts have not been changed, something we'll deal with more in the next video when we talk about the doctrine of salvation, then their motives are still corrupt and self-serving, even if they themselves are not aware of it. Sin enables man to deceive himself in amazing ways. Anyone who goes through a recovery program understands just how powerful denial is and how delusional one can become. From a biblical perspective, this is what sin does to a person, though it happens to different people to different degrees. The point remains, no matter how we strive to be righteous before God on our own, sin renders all of it corrupt. As Isaiah also says, "For all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a filthy garment. And all of us wither like a leaf, and our wrongdoings, like the wind, take us away." Isaiah 64:6. Incidentally, the term unclean garment is the term used to describe a bloody menstrual rag. Not exactly the most appealing term, except to some select weirdos online in the crunchiest corners of society. One last thing, sin is not confined to our actions alone, but extends even to our very thoughts. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7 and Luke 6:20-48, Christ elevates the standard of avoiding sin to even the very desires we have. "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court.' But I say to you, that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be answerable to the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Matthew 5:21-22 and verses 27-28. So, as I said in the previous video, there is never a time when we aren't violating God's law in some way or another. I don't mean that even when we're unconscious we're doing wrong, only that every day we fall short of God's standard, adding more and more to our own guilt. We are not sinners because we sin. We sin because we are sinners by our very nature, thanks to Adam. The ultimate consequence of sin is death, Romans 6:23, but I'll save that for our discussion of the fall of man. Now, with the doctrine of sin introduced, we need to discuss the nature of man. This doctrine is the doctrine of anthropology, coming from the Greek word anthropos, meaning, well, man. What does the Bible say about humanity as a creature? Well, first we have the Genesis account, specifically chapters 1 and 2, which give us a general overview of creation in chapter 1, and then a more granular view of what happened, culminating in the creation of Eve out of Adam's rib. Man was a special creation compared to the rest of the creatures, and is specifically said to have been made in God's image. Now, many have abused this language here and tied it with the creation of man and woman by saying, "See, the image of God is also female, so God is also female." I'm not going to go off onto a tangent about gender ideology at this point, since that's beyond the scope of this video, though there is an article about the issue I want to respond to later on that is a prime example of distorting the biblical record on this subject. And to give you a little taste though, one of the arguments is that gender probably isn't binary, because even though we know of things like day and night, the cycle of night and day is gradual and shifts slowly instead of like a light switch. So if the degree of daylight and nighttime is on a spectrum, gender probably is too.
What?
Yeah. The arguments don't get any better. In any case, the idea of being created in the image of God doesn't have anything to do with gender or sexuality. The idea is that, like God, we have rationality, emotions, desires, a will, or agency, if you prefer, the ability to choose between right and wrong, and things like that. It speaks of man as being a rational moral agent within creation. And we also know that man was created free from having a sin nature, and yet Adam still chose to sin. Eve disobeyed first, but as Paul points out to his protege Timothy, she wasn't the one to blame. For it was Adam who was first created and then Eve, and it was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a wrongdoer. 1 Timothy 2:13-14. Adam was right there with Eve when the temptation happened and said nothing to correct the serpent or to make sure Eve properly understood what God's command was. Adam failed in his responsibility to lead, which is another issue for another time. Through this act of dereliction and his subsequent rebellion against God, he was immediately cursed by sin and died spiritually. This means that both Adam and Eve were cut off from fellowship with God and the only source of spiritual life for man. Unless this spiritual relationship is restored somehow, man remains dead in sin and is, by nature now, the enemy of God. As Paul wrote to Ephesus, "And you, who are dead in your offenses and sins, in which you previously walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all previously lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the rest." Ephesians 2:1-3. This does not mean that being spiritually dead, we are passive in our sin. Quite the opposite. Man loves to sin because it is in our nature. We shouldn't, and there are many times when we know what we are doing is wrong, but we are destitute of anything that makes us want to choose God and choose to submit on His terms. As Paul said in Romans 5, we are incapable of doing so because our minds, our very desires, are hostile towards God. That is what it means to be a child of wrath, and we are all this way from birth. Now, as I said before, we see this manifest in different ways. Not everyone rebels to the same extent or in the same way. There are those that are murderers, thieves, rapists, and extortionists, and then there are those who are liars, gossips, and unbelievers. Yes, unbelief is itself a sin according to Scripture. All of these make us guilty before God, though our punishment is also determined by how much truth we reject. The more truth we have that we reject, the more severe our punishment in eternity. This is what Jesus meant when he told the Jews of his day that judgment would be more tolerable for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah who died in ignorance than for those who rejected the full revelation of the gospel. That's Matthew 10:15, 11:24, and Luke 10:12. So, to summarize up to this point on the doctrine of man, Adam and Eve were special creations by God and granted certain characteristics and attributes that were unique to mankind. Adam was given a test and failed, thus cursing all of humanity with sin and condemning us all. Incidentally, this is a concept known as federal headship and deals with the leader of a nation or people being their representative. If judgment falls against him, it falls against the people as well. We'll get more into this in the next video and how this ties into the idea of salvation. In the West, we are far more atomized and individualistic, so we tend to not like this concept. But whether you like it or not does nothing to eliminate the fact that this is what the Bible teaches. So, all of man fell in Adam and are thus corrupted by sin. We are born the enemies of God because sin has turned our minds against Him, even if we deceive ourselves into thinking otherwise. We are wholly cut off from the source of spiritual life that enables us to obey in a true sense, and we are therefore damned. Not a single one of us can escape this fact, no matter how hard we try. It is inevitable.
Now you see, the new world is inevitable.
It's what?
Inevitable.
One more time?
Inevitable!
Now, this all seems like a bit of a downer to end on, and it is. However, that's where the doctrine of salvation comes into play. I would love to dig into that more, but man, would you look at the time? Rats. I mean, I realize I can make these however long I want, but dagnabbit, I'm out of time. We'll pick up there again next time. As before, if you got something out of this, let me know, share it around and all that. I think after the next video, I'll probably have one more in the series where I finally tie all this together with what the Bible says about heaven and eternity, which really isn't all that much, believe it or not, and how it applies to the Reddit post that prompted all this. Well, in the meantime, you guys take care, and I will talk to you again soon.